barn, which was being converted, collapsed on top of them. The fire service were called to the barn in Church Road in Worlingworth near Eye around 5 o'clock this afternoon. Search teams have been sifting through the rubble, but no one else has been injured. From Worlingworth, Serena Sandhu reports.
It was at around 5 o'clock this afternoon that this quiet residential street in Worlingworth was overrun by emergency services. Contractors were working on renovating this old maltings barn behind me when the original red brick gable end collapsed, trapping 2 men underneath. A dog walker raised the alarm, but both men had sustained severe injuries. And despite attempts by air ambulance paramedics to resuscitate them, both were pronounced dead at the scene.
The gable end has come away from the building and collapsed and broken up as it's fallen onto the ground next to where the renovation work is taking place.
Relatives of the dead men watched on as search teams worked their way through the rubble. It took more than 2 hours to confirm there are no other people trapped inside. A neighbour told me that the barn used to be a pigsty, but had been sold to a building firm which was converting it into 3 houses. The rescue operation is now over, and in the morning the grim task of working out what happened here begins. But tonight there is grief and shock in this village for the 2 men who will not be returning home. Serena Sandhu, Anglia News, Worlingworth in Suffolk.
Hello, I'm Alex Dunlop with the Look East Late News. 2 people have died after a barn wall collapsed at Worlingworth in Suffolk. It's understood that the men were working on a conversion of the farm building in Church Road earlier this evening when the structure gave way, burying them under the rubble. An operation to recover their bodies is still ongoing.
The first crews were faced with a very serious situation where the gable end of a house undergoing renovation had collapsed and had trapped 2 persons beneath the rubble. We've checked all the surrounding area underneath the collapsed rubble to make sure that there are no other persons involved. And at the moment, crews are making the building safe so that we are in a position to remove the casualties from the scene.
Well, we'll have further updates on that story on BBC Radio Suffolk and on BBC Online.
An investigation is underway into how 2 men were killed as they worked on a barn conversion in Suffolk. It's thought around 20 tonnes of rubble came down on the pair as they worked on the site at Worlingworth yesterday afternoon. Our chief reporter Kim Riley has spent the morning at the scene. He joins us now. Kim.
Well, police have had a presence here right since the events of last night, events that have left people in this very quiet, remote village extremely shocked indeed. I can tell you that the 2 builders who died were not from the village. They were apparently working for a contractor and they were working on underpinning the foundations of this listed building. It was actually a dog walker walking past the site, alongside the site, who raised the alarm. Firefighters were first on the scene last night, soon joined by the air ambulance and the hazardous area response team, paramedics trained in working in unsafe areas. Despite their best efforts, both men were pronounced dead. The remains of the brick gable end that collapsed onto them clearly visible by daylight. The dilapidated former maltings was being converted into 3 homes. Retired farm worker John Smith told me its history.
Well, when I went to school, that was a dairy. Then later on, that was turned into a pigsty. And I've been empty for 20 years, I should think now, and just sort of laid and decayed for the last 20 years.
What's your thoughts about what's now happened?
Well, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. You know, shocked all on us, really. It's a shame, a lovely old building trying to be restored and 2 people have lost life over it.
Former London firefighter and graphic designer Chris Reynolds overlooks the barn. It's been a building site for more than a year. His wife, one of several local people who heard the collapse.
I think a few of the neighbours heard it. I mean, it was a loud crashing noise. I mean, you've got 20 tonne of brickwork coming down, you're going to hear something. So she did hear it, and of course when she found out later what had happened, she was very upset by it. A small village like this, very rural, very quiet, and people going about their business, you don't expect to have things like this happen. I mean, you normally, you see this on the news elsewhere, but somewhere as quiet and small as this, it is a shock to the whole village.
In the past hour, a team from the Health and Safety Executive and detectives from Suffolk Police have arrived here. They both say they'll be working very closely together to try and find the sequence of events that led to such a tragic outcome.
Kim, thank you very much. The Conservative...
Hello from Jonathan and from me. Welcome to the programme.
First tonight, a small village in Suffolk remains in shock after 2 builders were killed when a barn wall collapsed on top of them.
The accident happened in Worlingworth near Eye yesterday afternoon. The men were converting a barn off Shop Street when the gable end fell down, crushing them both.
Well, Anglia's Serena Sandy was one of the first journalists on the scene last night, and we can join her now. Serena, what more do we know this evening about exactly what happened then?
Well, emergency services were actually called to this quiet residential street yesterday afternoon after a dog walker raised the alarm. Paramedics tried to resuscitate 2 men, but to no avail. Today, the men have been named locally as Kevin Ruffles, who's in his 50s, and 19-year-old Matthew Skeet from Halsey and Woodbridge, respectively. Now, you can see the digger behind me that's got Mr. Ruffles' name on it. This morning, the grim task began of investigating just what really did happen here last night. In daylight, the true horror of what happened here is clear. The void where the original red brick gable end of this listed building used to stand. Tons of rubble still remain, evidence of the tragedy that took place. It was at around 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon that this quiet residential street in Worlingworth was overrun by emergency services.
It all really happened very quickly. So from coming back, we just looked over the road and there's this great hole in the end of the building. It had gone.
Yes.
And after that, I mean, everybody just arrived. You know, the ambulance, more fire and rescue, the police arrived.
A dog walker raised the alarm when the wall of this 18th century old maltings barn collapsed, trapping 2 men underneath. Both suffered severe injuries and, despite attempts by air ambulance paramedics to resuscitate them, both men died at the scene.
Normal building going on. I have been in there for a year, 18 months now, and quite horrendous, really.
Terrible. It's somewhere as quiet as this, and you have something like this happen. I mean, it's the sort of thing you read in newspapers happening elsewhere, but not somewhere as quiet as this.
I was here last night as relatives of the deceased watched on. Rescue teams sifted through the rubble by hand. It took more than 2 hours to confirm there were no other people trapped inside. The men, thought to be Kevin Ruffles and Matthew Skeet, were subcontractors working on underpinning the foundations of this former pigsty. They were employed by a firm who were converting the barn into 3 houses. Today, a single yellow rose was left in tribute. Mr. Ruffles used to be a landlord at the Shepherd and Dog in Halsey.
Visually, he's certainly a gentle giant. He was, you couldn't miss Kevin. And he was a really genuine guy, and he'd help anybody. And nothing was too much to help, for him to help someone else.
Detectives from Suffolk Police and a team from the Health and Safety Executive visited the site today to try and piece together how this tragedy happened.
We're keen to know that the cause of the accident, whether there's any criminal offences involved, is something that the police have to establish. And as I say, we're drawing on the expertise of the Health and Safety Executive and their experts. But it's important that we find out what happened, also for the family's perspective.
Although incidents like this are rare, there is still much grief today in this small village for the 2 men who will not be returning home.
Well, Serena, back to you. Clearly the investigation is at a very early stage, but what's the situation there tonight?
Well, Becky, what we do know tonight is that Suffolk Police are actually leading the investigation, and they're actually being assisted by the Health and Safety Executive. Now, post-mortems have been carried out today on both of the bodies, but their results haven't yet been released. Now, what we do expect tonight is that formal identification of the 2 men is expected to take place, and we do expect over the weekend that those names will be officially released.
Serena, thanks very much.